Today we're going to be looking at Unit 5 using data notes. So we have 4 vocabulary words. Take a look at your vocabulary sheet for the definition of each of these words. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first one. So before the 2010 elections for members of the U.S. House of Representatives, pollsters called American households on their landline phones to see how they plan to vote. What kind of sample bias might this affect on the poll? So what we're going to be doing basically today is we're going to be looking at what is happening with these questions, and then from there we're going to be determining, do we have some kind of a bias that's happening, and if so, does it change the result of our data? So the first thing we're going to do is identify the attended population. So step 1. So the population is all likely voters. Is all likely voters. The next thing we're going to do is identify the sample method. So step 2 is the data was collected by landline. So the sample is all voters who use a landline. And then lastly, we're going to determine the potential bias in this poll. So step 3. Because not all voters have landlines, the results could be skewed. Meaning that it can lean to one way or to the other. Now let's take a look at question 2. For example 2, we want to see if there's a bias that's happening in our question. So a survey organization wants to see what percent of New York citizens support a ban on soft drink. The question posed is, do you support a ban on soft drinks which contribute to heart disease and tooth decay? So that's the question that they're using. So we want to identify if there's going to be a bias. And so we're going to identify the purpose of the question. So our first step is to find the percent of New York citizens who support a ban on soft drinks. Step 2. This is going to identify potential bias in the question. So the question does have some bias in it, and here's what it is. If they just had asked, do you support a ban on soft drinks, it might be different than if you had asked, do you support a ban on soft drinks, which contributes to heart disease and tooth decay? It's telling you what's happening when you drink soft drinks. So the question lists some health risks for soft drinks. This might have an increase in yes for ban. So based on this, does this serve the bias of the group? The survey organizers want to see the percent of New York citizen? Yes, it does. So this bias serves the interests of health groups. Because health groups want to ban it, and it's telling you what happens if you were to consume soft drinks. So this is serving their interests. Let's look at data summary. So a teacher wants to tell his students how the average student did on exam. So he looks at the score in his gradebook. 2 students scored a 0 because they stopped showing up for class in the last month and did not take the exam. He uses the mean of 71 as his measure of center. Does the mean accurately represent the data? So when we look at this, will the mean accurately represent the data? Well, if we were to find what the median is, the median of this data set is 87, and the mode of this data set is 91. So the mean of 71 is affected by these 2 zeros right here. These 2 zeros are bringing down what our average is. However, basically, if you showed up for this test, you scored an 82 or higher. So you did really well on this test. You got a B on this test. So the mean does not do a good job of representing this data. The median of 87 is not affected by this 0, the low score, or the 91, the high score. It's kind of right in the middle of what all the students scored. So this is going to be a little bit better. In the mode, so not good. Because of zeros. And the mode is not good because it's most common score. Now, if we had taken the mean without the zeros, then that would be a better judge of what's going on with the data. But based on what he has so far, the median is going to be his best result. He had some students score below that. He had some students score above that. But right in the middle, it was 87. So that's a good judge for him for all of his data. Let's take a look at example 4. So a group compares 2 soccer players who play the same position from different teams. They make a graph on the number of goals scored through the season for each player. Do the graphs misrepresent the data? Whose interest might be served by the representation? So we got player 1 and we got player 2. So if we look at player 1's graph, we got the months in the season, and then we got our total goals going by an interval of 5. For player 2, we have the months of the season, and we have our total goals going by a interval of 10. So we want to identify what misleading information we have. So the purpose of the graph is to compare the two goalies. So step 1, or no, not step 1, we'll just say purpose. To look at the two players. And if we look at this, based on the graph, which one looks like the better player? Player 1 or player 2? And if we look at it, it looks like player 1 is because they're higher up than player 2 is. But as we said, player 1 is going by 5. So player 1, scale on X, or Y axis, goes by 5s. Player 2, scale on Y axis, goes by 10s. And if we look at the last point, right here and right here, both players scored 30 goals. So they're the same. They both scored 30 goals by the end of the season. So player 1 is at an advantage. Or players 1 interests are served. That's the question. That's the wording that they use. Player 1's interests are served by the graphs. It makes player 2 look like they're not as good as player 1, but in reality, player 1 and player 2 scored the same amount of goals. So this section is going over bias and data representation. So write a summary at the bottom about how we can identify bias and how we can identify misrepresentation of graphs. And then you're going to look through the practice for today and use these notes to help you out with identifying bias.